Words matter. In American politics, some phrases cut through the noise, exposing uncomfortable truths. On October 6, 2025, White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller uttered one such phrase, plenary authority. In a tense standoff with Oregon, President Trump insisted he could deploy the National Guard over the governor's objections. Miller, defending this on national TV, invoked plenary authority, a term suggesting absolute, unchecked power. The phrase landed like a thunderclap, crystallizing fears about the erosion of democratic limits. Suddenly, the debate wasn't about policy, but about the very nature of American government. What are the real limits on presidential power? What does separation of powers mean when a single word threatens to override it? Plenary authority became shorthand for executive overreach, a ghost of monarchy haunting a republic. In that moment, a constitutional crisis was distilled into a single chilling word. The stage was set. Stephen Miller, a senior advisor to the president, sat beneath the harsh studio lights of CNN, ready to defend the administration's controversial decision to override a federal judge and Oregon's governor. The air was thick with anticipation, as millions tuned in, aware that this was no ordinary interview. The stakes were high, and the nation's attention was fixed on what would unfold. The anchor, voice steady but eyes sharp, pressed Miller on a crucial point. Would the White House actually comply with the court's order, or would it defy the judiciary's authority? The question hung in the air, echoing the tension felt across the country. Miller, stone-faced and unwavering, began his response. Under Title 10, the president has plenary authority, he started, invoking sweeping executive power. His words were measured, but his tone suggested absolute certainty. And then, suddenly, silence. Miller froze, mid-sentence, his expression locked in place for 15 agonizing seconds. The studio lights seemed to grow brighter, the silence more deafening, as viewers everywhere wondered what had just happened. The anchor, visibly confused, glanced off camera, searching for answers. With no explanation, she blamed a technical glitch and abruptly cut away, leaving the audience in suspense. But the image of Miller, stopped cold as he claimed absolute power, spread like wildfire online. Screenshots, memes, and video clips flooded social media within minutes, turning the moment into instant viral fodder. Was it truly a technical glitch, or did someone behind the scenes pull the plug before Miller could go further? Theories abounded, with some suspecting deliberate censorship and others chalking it up to coincidence. The ambiguity only fueled the moment's power. Viewers debated the incident in living rooms and online forums, dissecting every frame and speculating about what might have been said next. The pause became a metaphor. Miller's claim of unchecked authority was so audacious, it seemed to short-circuit the broadcast itself. The technical failure mirrored the nation's own sense of disbelief and anxiety. Suddenly, the interview was no longer about Oregon or a single court order. It was about the very foundations of American democracy, the limits of presidential power, and the fragility of the rule of law. The plenary authority gaffe became a Rorschach test for a nation on edge, exposing deep divisions and forcing Americans to confront uncomfortable questions about who holds power and how far that power should go. For most viewers, plenary authority was unfamiliar legalese. Its meaning is stark: total, unqualified power, unchecked by any other branch. In U.S. law, plenary is rare and tightly limited, usually reserved for Congress in specific areas like immigration. Even then, it's constrained by the Constitution. Miller's claim that the president holds plenary authority over the military was radical, an assertion of power more fitting for a monarch than a president. If accepted, it would erase the checks and balances that define American government. The president could deploy troops at will, immune from court or congressional review. This isn't just a broad reading of the law, it's a philosophy that upends 2 centuries of American tradition. Miller's words weren't a slip, they were a blueprint for executive supremacy. The shock was immediate. Could one person really claim such power in a democracy? The idea of plenary authority, absolute unchecked power, runs headlong into the very heart of the Constitution, the separation of powers. This foundational principle is not just a technicality, but the bedrock of American democracy, designed to prevent any one branch from dominating the others. The framers, deeply scarred by the abuses of monarchy, were determined to avoid the rise of another king. In Philadelphia, they argued, compromised, and ultimately split government into three distinct branches: legislative, executive, and judicial, to ensure that no single person or group could seize total control. Congress crafts and passes the laws, the president is tasked with enforcing them, and the courts interpret what those laws mean. Each branch is given unique powers, but also the ability to check and balance the others, creating a system of mutual accountability. But when Stephen Miller asserted that the president could override both Congress and the courts in matters of domestic force, he was proposing a radical departure from this system. His claim suggested that the president alone could decide the limits of his own power, bypassing the very safeguards the framers put in place. Judicial review, a cornerstone of American law, means that even the president must obey court orders. The Supreme Court and lower courts have the final say on what the Constitution allows, ensuring that no one, not even the commander-in-chief, is above the law. To claim plenary authority is to claim the right to stand above the law itself, a direct challenge to the very notion of constitutional government. This isn't just a theoretical debate for scholars or lawyers. It's a real, urgent question about who truly holds power in a democracy. Is it a single leader, or is it the system of laws and institutions that have guided the nation for generations? For more than 2 centuries, Americans have answered that question by reaffirming their commitment to government by law, not by the will of one person. The Constitution has endured precisely because it limits power, not because it grants it without restraint. Miller's statement threatened to upend that answer, putting the presidency on a direct collision course with the Constitution itself. The very fabric of American democracy seemed to hang in the balance. The stakes could not have been clearer. Would the nation be governed by the rule of law, or by the unchecked will of a single individual? In that moment, the nation was forced to confront a fundamental choice, one that would define the future of American democracy. Miller's claim rested on Title 10 of the U.S. Code, a foundational set of laws that governs the structure, duties, and powers of the United States Armed Forces. Title 10 is not just a technicality, it's the legal backbone for how the military operates under civilian control, and it sets strict boundaries for when and how military force can be used within the country. Title 10 does grant the president power to federalize the National Guard, but this authority is not open-ended. It can only be invoked under very specific and dire circumstances, such as an invasion by a foreign power, a rebellion against the authority of the United States, or when it becomes impossible to enforce federal law through ordinary means. These are rare and extreme situations, not everyday occurrences. These provisions are not blank checks for presidential action. They are emergency measures, carefully designed to be used only as a last resort. Every use of this power is subject to legal standards and judicial review, ensuring that the president cannot simply bypass the courts or Congress. The Insurrection Act, which dates back to the early 1800s, adds another layer of complexity. It allows the president to deploy federal troops domestically, but only in the most extreme cases, when local authorities are unable or unwilling to maintain public order, or when civil rights are being denied. President Trump had previously threatened to invoke these laws to override local officials during times of unrest, raising concerns about the potential for abuse of executive power and the delicate balance between federal and state authority. But both Title 10 and the Insurrection Act are ultimately limited by the Constitution and the oversight of the courts. The framers of the Constitution were deeply wary of unchecked executive power, and they built in safeguards to prevent any president from acting unilaterally. A president cannot simply declare an emergency to seize power or sidestep the rule of law. Judges can and do intervene, reviewing the legality of executive actions and protecting constitutional rights. Miller's argument ignored these crucial limits, seeking to erase judicial oversight and expand presidential authority far beyond what the law allows. This approach would have undermined the very checks and balances that define American democracy. The law is clear. Even in times of crisis, executive power is not absolute. The Constitution, the courts, and the rule of law all serve as guardrails to prevent overreach. The claim of plenary authority was not just a misreading of the law. It was a legal overreach, and a reminder of why constitutional limits matter, especially in moments of national stress. The courts pushed back. In Oregon, a federal judge blocked the National Guard deployment, ruling the administration hadn't met the legal threshold. Across the country, judges rejected similar attempts to expand executive power. These rulings affirmed the president's authority is not self-declared, It must be justified under law. The administration's response was defiance, appealing rulings and attacking judges. But the judiciary stood firm, upholding checks and balances. The battle over executive power became a constitutional stress test, with the courts on the front lines. The fight wasn't just in courtrooms, it was in the streets. The No Kings protests swept the nation, as citizens rallied against what they saw as creeping authoritarianism. Signs read, "We already fought a war against a king," and "checks and balances, not a blank check." The protests were a public reaffirmation of American principles, signaling that executive overreach was a real, present threat. When Miller uttered plenary authority, the public was primed to react. The viral moment confirmed fears and galvanized resistance. Judges provided legal checks, protesters provided political and moral ones. The message was clear: in a democracy, power belongs to the people, not to a would-be king. Miller's 15-second freeze became a cultural phenomenon. The plenary pause trended online, spawning memes and late-night skits. The real impact, though, was educational. Suddenly, millions were debating constitutional law. News outlets published explainers. Legal scholars filled the airwaves. The administration's claim of legality was drowned out by accusations of extremism. The phrase plenary authority became a symbol of executive overreach. The gaffe was a public relations disaster, staining the administration's legacy. The viral pause was more than a meme. It was a civics lesson, reminding Americans why limits on power matter. The moment became a lasting warning. Unchecked authority is always a threat. Why does it matter if a president claims too much power? The American experiment is built on the rejection of unchecked authority. Liberty survives only when power is divided, and every official is accountable to law and people. Plenary authority erases accountability, threatening rights and the rule of law. This isn't partisan, it's constitutional. The claim of plenary authority isn't just a stretch, it's an attempt to erase limits entirely. The story of Miller's gaffe is a reminder. Democracy is a choice, not a guarantee. It must be defended, sometimes, against a single chilling word.